On the 19th of September 1944, Colonel Harold "Bucky" Harris climbed into a small Stinson OY-1 observation plane and flew over a piece of ground that the men below him were dying to take. The island of Peleliu had been described in every briefing, on every map, by every naval intelligence officer as dominated by what one document flatly called low rolling hills. Harris had read those documents. He had attended the same briefings as every other man in the 1st Marine Division. And now, 4 days into the battle, he was looking at what the documents had called low rolling hills. What he saw instead was a maze of sheer limestone cliffs, box canyons, jagged ridges, and cave mouths running through the rock in every direction. Not 10 caves, not 50, hundreds, some of them fitted with sliding armored steel doors, some of them tunneled so deep into the coral that no bomb, no naval shell, no amount of fire from the sea had touched anything inside. The Japanese had not built a beach defense, they had built a fortress. And the fortress had been invisible, buried under jungle canopy so thick that every photograph taken from altitude had shown nothing but green. Harris landed, went straight to his division commander, and told him what he had seen. He said the Brogel could not be taken the way it was currently being attacked from the south, regiment after regiment charging uphill against mutually supporting cave positions. He said the approach had to change. Come from the north. Use firepower, not bodies. Lay siege to the thing. Don't keep throwing men at a limestone wall. Major General William Rupertus and Colonel Louis Chesty Puller listened to what Harris said. Then they told him they had their maps. What happened next on Peleliu is one of the most costly dismissed warnings in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The regiment that took the advice, Harris's 5th Marines, fought the same terrain, faced the same Japanese defenders, and came out the other side, with 15 killed and 33 wounded, taking a fortified island. The regiment that ignored it, Puller's 1st Marines, suffered 1,749 casualties in 6 days. 70% of the regiment, companies reduced to platoons, platoons reduced to squads. Men who had survived Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, 3 years of war, ground down to nothing on a piece of coral 2 miles wide. This is the story of how the 1st Marine Division walked into Peleliu, believing a 4-day timetable and a set of aerial photographs, and what it cost them. It is the story of a colonel who flew over the truth, reported it accurately, was dismissed, and then proved himself right in the most brutal way available, by fighting the same fight the right way, while men a few hundred yards away were being killed the wrong way. And it is the story of the one moment in the Pacific War when the Japanese completely reversed their entire defensive doctrine and the Americans, almost completely, failed to notice. To understand what Bucky Harris saw from that OY-1 on September 19th, you have to understand what the 1st Marine Division thought they were sailing into. The Palaus campaign, codenamed Operation Stalemate II, existed for one reason: an airfield. The coral island of Peleliu, roughly 6 miles long and 2 miles wide at its widest point, sat 550 miles east of the Philippines. It had a Japanese airstrip that American planners believed posed a threat to General Douglas MacArthur's planned landings on Leyte. Eliminate the airfield, neutralize the island, move on. That was the logic. What made the logic even more compelling was the pre-invasion intelligence picture. Navy carrier aircraft had flown over Peleliu repeatedly. Army B-24S had dropped more than 600 tons of bombs on it. 3 days of naval gunfire from battleships and cruisers had expended 519 rounds of 1 6-inch shells and nearly 2,000 rounds of smaller caliber. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf looked at his results and declared with full confidence that he had run out of targets. When reporters asked Rupertus how long the battle would take, he said 4 days. Rough but fast. He was so certain of this that 30 of the 36 accredited war correspondents took him at his word and left for better stories. The reason Oldendorf thought he'd run out of targets, and the reason Rupertus thought it would take 4 days, was the same reason the 1st Marine Division had no idea what was waiting for them. Every photograph, every aerial survey, every bit of intelligence they had showed the central spine of the island, the Ummerbrogel mountain complex, as a long ridge clothed in jungle vegetation. They called it high ground. They expected it to have some fortifications. They had drawn phase lines for a steady south to north advance, one ridge at a time, the way amphibious doctrine said it worked. What no aerial photograph could see was what was underneath the vegetation. Not because the cameras were bad, because the Japanese had changed the game entirely, and the Americans didn't know it yet. In March of 1944, 6 months before the Marines landed on Peleliu, Lieutenant General Sade Inoue met in Tokyo with Premier Hideki Tojo to discuss what had gone wrong in the Pacific. The answer was not complicated. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa to the Marshalls to the Marianas, the pattern was the same. Japanese forces contested the beach. American naval and air firepower annihilated them. The survivors charged in banzai attacks that accomplished nothing except to empty the island of defenders faster. By the time the Americans reached the interior, the fight was over. Tojo's answer to this problem became known as Fukaku defense in depth. Stop defending the beach, let the Americans come ashore. Then make them pay for every inch of interior ground by fighting from underground positions that no ship's gun and no aircraft bomb could reach unless it landed directly in a cave mouth. Hold out not for hours, but for weeks, months, until the Americans bled to the point where they might consider negotiation, or at least until they understood the price they would pay for the home islands themselves. The man who would implement Fukaku on Peleliu was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. He was 46 years old, a career infantry officer who had fought in China, a man his superiors specifically chose for this command because of his skill as a tactician. When Nakagawa left Japan for Peleliu, he told his wife he would not be coming back. He arrived on the island and immediately began the work of turning it into something the Americans had never faced. The Ummerbrogel mountain complex was, geologically, exactly what Nakagawa needed. Peleliu had once been part of the ocean floor. Volcanic pressure had forced it above the surface, and the uplift had buckled and cracked the coral limestone into a maze of ridges, sinkholes, box canyons, and natural caves running in every direction through the rock. Many of those caves had been enlarged years earlier by the Nanyo Kohatsu Kaisha Mining Company, which had worked phosphate deposits on the island using Korean and Palauan labor and a narrow-gauge railroad. The mine shafts ran deep into the coral. Nakagawa's engineers turned them into fighting positions. 500 limestone caves in the Ummerbrogel alone, connected by tunnels, fitted with sliding armored steel doors that could be opened to fire artillery and closed before the return fire arrived. Cave entrances cut at angles to deflect grenades and flamethrower jets, multiple exit routes so a position could be evacuated and reoccupied from another direction, electric lighting in the deepest chambers, an underground command post big enough to hold Nakagawa's entire headquarters staff, and over it all, before the pre-invasion bombardment stripped it away, a canopy of jungle so dense that not one aerial photograph in the American files showed a single indication of what was below. This was what the 1st Marine Division was approaching on the morning of the 15th of September, 1944, singing "Give My Regards to Broadway" from the first wave of LVTs. At 8:32 inches the morning, the first wave hit the beaches. Within an hour, the steel doors on the Umerbrogel ridgeline rolled open. The Japanese had not defended at the water's edge, not in any serious way. 1 battalion deployed on the beach. The plan was always for that unit to absorb the initial assault and buy time, not to stop it. The real defense was inland, and the moment the Marines moved off the beach, they walked into pre-registered kill zones that Nakagawa's gunners had been sighting since the day his regiment arrived. By 9:30 that first morning, the Japanese had destroyed 60 American LVTs and DUKWs. The 1st Marines, assigned to take the northern beach sector and then pivot to assault the Umerbrogel from the south, hit a coral ridge 30 feet high on their left flank the moment they cleared the water. This ridge, which Marines would name the Point, had been blasted into a fortress by Nakagawa's engineers' holes cut through rock to house 47mm guns and 20mm cannons firing along the length of the beach. Puller's LVT was hit by an artillery round on his way in. His communications section was destroyed getting to shore. The regiment started its first day, missing its commander's ability to see and coordinate, and it never really recovered. By dark on D-Day, the Marines held their 2 miles of beach and not much else. The 1st Marines had pushed 100 yards. 100 yards. In the south, Harris's 5th Marines had made substantially better progress, driven straight across the airfield under Japanese tank attack, knocked out the armor, and reached the eastern shore. The 7th Marines under Colonel Herman Hannikin had moved steadily through the southern tip of the island. But on the left, where the 1st Marines were supposed to neutralize the threat to every other Marine on the island, the regiment was bleeding into the coral. D-Day casualties across the division. Over 1,100 Marines, more than 200 of them dead. The bloodiest single day the 1st Marine Division had seen since World War I. Rupertus, who had broken an ankle at Guadalcanal and could not walk the ridgelines himself, sat at his command post and ordered his commanders to maintain momentum. What made the next 6 days what they became was a combination of terrain, doctrine, and the particular stubbornness of 2 men who had both spent decades in the Marine Corps and believed with everything in them that will and aggression were the answer to any tactical problem. Puller was legendary. 4 Navy Crosses. Combat in Haiti, Nicaragua, China, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester. He had more experience leading men in combat than almost any officer in the Corps. He also had exactly one tactical approach: straight ahead. When the battalions called for help, he told them to keep pushing. When his officers described what the terrain looked like from inside it, he told them to keep pushing. He was carrying 2-inch-long shrapnel in his left leg from Guadalcanal that had never been removed, which had flared into an open wound that kept him from walking properly. He ran his regiment from a command post further forward than it should have been, which meant he could see his men but couldn't always see the picture. And Rupertus, hobbling on his broken ankle in the rear, kept sending the same order every morning: all infantry units will resume the attack with maximum effort in all sectors at 0830. The Umerbrogel rewarded this approach with murder. The terrain was not what it appeared from any map. It was not a ridge. It was dozens of separate ridges, sinkholes, and ravines packed together, each one with a different elevation, each one with cave mouths opening at every conceivable angle. When a Marine company took the top of one ridge, the next ridge to the north could fire directly down on them. When they dropped into a valley to avoid that fire, The ridges on both sides had interlocking fields of fire into the valley floor. Every time the Marines seized a position, the Japanese simply used the tunnel network to reoccupy it from behind. There was no front line. There was no clear direction of attack. There was only the coral, the heat temperatures reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and the caves. One company commander, Captain Everett Pope of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led his men up a ridge late in the battle that turned out to be a bare, isolated knob with no cover and no possibility of resupply. Through the night, he held it against Japanese counterattacks, his men throwing grenades and then, when the grenades ran out, rocks and empty ammunition boxes. When dawn came, he had 8 unwounded men left. He was ordered to withdraw. He had to leave his dead on the ridge because there was no one alive to carry them. He later received the Medal of Honor for that night. He always said he didn't know what he was supposed to have done differently. By D+3, the 1st Marines had suffered 1,236 casualties, and Rupertus was still ordering attacks. By D+5, General Roy Geiger, the 3 Amphibious Corps commander, came forward, visited Puller's command post, and found a man who could barely walk on his infected leg and could barely explain his regiment's situation coherently. Geiger looked at the casualty reports and made a decision over Rupertus's objections. The 1st Marines were done. They would be relieved immediately. When the regiment walked off the line, they had been there 6 days. They had lost 1,749 men, 70% of the regiment that had landed on September 15th. Companies that had landed with 200 men were down to 20. One battalion had a 71% casualty rate. Only 74 men fit for duty remained in the entire 1st Battalion's rifle companies. PFC Eugene Sledge of the 5th Marines watched them come out and wrote later, "What once had been companies in the 1st Marines looked like platoons. Platoons looked like squads. I saw few officers." Puller later said of those orders to attack repeatedly, "It was more or less of a massacre. There was no way to cut down losses and follow orders." Now go back 4 days to September 19th, and Colonel Harold "Bucky" Harris in his OY-1 observation plane. Harris was 43 years old, a career Marine officer from Vermont. He had graduated from Dartmouth College and joined the Corps in the early 1920s. He had extensive pre-war experience. Though he was relatively new to the 5th Marines, this was his first combat command of the regiment. He was known by the men who worked with him as a man who kept his head. Not flashy, not theatrical. He did not have Puller's legend or Rupertus's authority. What he had was the ability to look at a thing clearly and say what he saw. What he saw from the OY-1 on September 19th changed his entire understanding of the battle. The official USMC monograph on the Peleliu campaign, written by Gordon Gale, describes the moment precisely. Harris's aerial reconnaissance altered his view of the Brogel from sober to grave. It convinced him that attacking the pocket from the north would be less costly than the originally planned and ordered. Attempts from south to north. And when he landed and brought this to Rupertus and Puller, when he urged them to go up in the plains themselves to see what he had seen, both men responded the same way. They told him they had their maps. Those maps described the Brogel as gently rounded, north-south, high ground. The maps had been built from aerial photographs taken before the bombardment stripped the jungle, photographs that showed nothing but a green ridge. Harris had now seen with his own eyes what was under the green. He had seen the cliffs. He had seen the cave mouths. He had seen the geometry of the thing, how the ridges oriented to cover approaches from the south. How approaching from the north would break the terrain into separate compartments that could be reduced one at a time rather than assaulted as a single impossible wall. Rupertus and Puller looked at their maps and told him the plan would proceed. One sentence in the USMC official history summarizes what Harris did next. Disgusted by the prospect of seeing his men needlessly slaughtered, he decided to rely as much as possible on overwhelming firepower, or, as he himself put it, to be lavish with ordnance and stingy with men's lives. The contrast between how Harris ran his regiment and how the Brogel was being fought on the other side of the island is not subtle. After securing the airfield with the 5th Marines, Harris was tasked with assaulting Engezibus, a small island connected to Peleliu's northern tip by a causeway about 600 yards across a shallow reef. Engezibus held Japanese artillery positions that were firing into the Marines on Peleliu. It also had an incomplete Japanese airfield. The obvious approach was the causeway, a straight road connection between the two islands. Harris looked at the causeway and decided it was a killing ground. Any Japanese commander with functional artillery would have pre-registered every inch of that causeway. Harris planned a shore-to-shore amphibious landing instead, hitting Engezibus from the water at an angle the defenders would not expect. On September 28th, Harris coordinated one of the most methodical pre-assault bombardments of the Peleliu campaign. Army 155 mm guns, naval gunfire, howitzers from the 11th Marines. And then the Corsairs of VMF 114, which had just arrived on the captured Peleliu airstrip so close to the target that their pilots, making bombing runs on Engezibus, did not bother to raise their landing gear between strikes. The flight time from the Peleliu strip to Engezibus was so short that the gear was still retracting when they arrived over the island. The landing went in under continuous strafing. Marine Corps Aviation, for the first time in the Pacific War, provided exclusively Marine air support for a Marine landing, no Navy aircraft, no Army Air Forces, just Corsairs. The last 200 yards of the assault wave's approach was covered by strafing runs that continued until the lead Amtraks were 30 yards from the shoreline. Engezibus fell in a single day. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines killed 470 Japanese defenders. Their own losses, 15 killed, 33 wounded. 48 Marines for a fortified island full of cave positions. Compare that to the 1st Marines' 6 days in the Brogel. Compare 1,749 to 48. The terrain was different, the tactical situation was different, and it would not be fair to treat those numbers as a perfect, controlled experiment. But they tell you something about what happened when Harris's approach was applied versus what happened when it wasn't. By early October, the campaign had settled into its true shape. The 7th Marines had gone into the Brogel after the 1st Marines and suffered 46% casualties before being relieved in turn. Rupertus, who had been insisting since D-Day that his Marines would clear the island without Army help, had finally run out of Marine regiments that could fight. On October 5th, he ordered Harris and the 5th Marines into the Brogel pocket. Harris went in with 2 firm concepts and would not be moved from either of them. First, the attack comes from the north, no attacks from the south. The same approach he had urged 3 weeks earlier, dismissed 3 weeks earlier, was now the only approach he would permit his regiment to take. The official USMC monograph on the battle records this directly. Harris reversed the direction of all prior attacks and made the main drive down from the north. The terrain inside the pocket was compartmentalized. Coming from the north, each ridge, each valley, each cluster of caves could be isolated and reduced separately before moving to the next. Attacking from the south meant fighting uphill into interlocking fields of fire with no ability to isolate or maneuver. Harris's words, from the official record, the methodical reduction of enemy positions was possible in driving southward due to the compartmentation of the terrain. It was this slow but steady eating away of the Jap defenses that gave the real payoff. Second, firepower first, always. Bulldozers pushing narrow tracks into the pocket to allow tanks and flame-throwing Amtraks to reach positions they had never been able to reach. Artillery pieces manhandled up cliff faces to firing positions inside the pocket to batter enemy caves from close range. Corsairs in constant rotation, bombing and napalming specific identified positions. Naval guns on call, engineers with demolitions, flamethrowers. Every tool in the American inventory brought to bear before a rifleman moved forward. Rupertus kept demanding faster results. Harris kept siege fighting at his own pace. The USMC official history of the battle's final operations, covering when Army General Mueller's 81st Division took over from the Marines, makes an observation that seems almost designed to summarize what had happened during the preceding weeks. Mueller's plan for reducing the Umerbrogel pocket, the history notes, closely resembled the tactics that Colonel Harris, commanding officer of the 5th Marines, had advocated several weeks earlier. This was the plan Rupertus had dismissed on September 19th, when Harris landed from his reconnaissance flight. This was the plan that eventually ended the battle. While Harris was applying his methods in the pocket, something else was happening that tells you everything about how Peleliu had unfolded. On September 21st, after Geiger relieved the 1st Marines over Rupertus's objection, Rupertus expressed the belief that his Marines, alone, would shortly clear the entire island. 3 days after that, after the Army's 321st Regimental Combat Team had already landed, Rupertus was still insisting he didn't need outside help. His precise words, reported through the chain of command, were that the Marines were nearly done. Meanwhile, the Umerbrogel still held 1,500 Japanese soldiers who would fight to the last man, which is precisely what almost every one of them did. Colonel Nakagawa's garrison had started with roughly 10,500 men. By October 12th, his radio message to headquarters put his remaining effective strength at 1,150. He was out of tanks. He was low on artillery ammunition. He had been compressed into a shrinking perimeter centered on 5 limestone ridges the Marines called the Five Sisters, 2 valleys called the Horseshoe and Wildcat Bowl, and a jagged reef of rock they called the China Wall. He knew, and had always known, that he was not going to survive Peleliu. He had told his wife that when he left Japan, what he was doing now was fulfilling the Fukaku mission, not winning, not surviving, but making the Americans pay the highest possible price for every foot of ground. On November 24th, from his final command post in a vertical cave in the China Wall Ridge, Nakagawa sent his last radio message to headquarters at Koror. Sakura, Sakura, cherry blossoms. The coded phrase that meant organized resistance had ended. Then he and his chief of staff, Major General Kenji Murai, performed seppuku. Nakagawa was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. He was found years later by American veterans. Returning to the island, his command post was a natural vertical cavity in the rock, sealed by time, untouched since 1944, still full of the equipment and documents of a man who had turned a 7-square-mile island into a battle that lasted 73 days. The island that Rupertus had said would take 4 days was declared officially secured on the 27th of November, 1944, 73 days after the first wave hit the beach. The question that has followed Peleliu through 8 decades of military history is whether it should have been fought at all. 2 days before D-Day, Admiral William Halsey sent a recommendation to cancel Operation Stalemate entirely. He had just completed carrier strikes that found the Philippines far more vulnerable than American planners believed. His argument was direct. Peleliu's garrison was strategically isolated. The airfield could not threaten operations far beyond its effective range. The cost of taking it would not be worth the result. He was overruled by Admiral Nimitz, who said the invasion was already in motion. Halsey was right. The Peleliu airfield played no meaningful role in any subsequent operation. The Pacific Fleet's staging base for the Okinawa campaign was Ulithi Atoll in the Caroline Islands, not Peleliu. Every strategic justification for the battle had evaporated before the first Marine hit the beach, and nobody with the authority to stop it had the information necessary to know that in time. Total American casualties at Peleliu: 1,794 killed, 8,010 wounded. The Marine casualty rate per square mile exceeded what American forces suffered at Normandy. For the 1st Marine Division, the blood cost was so severe that the division remained out of action until the invasion of Okinawa on the 1st of April 1945, 6 months later. An entire Marine division, one of the most experienced fighting formations in the American military, spent half a year rebuilding from a battle that should never have happened. There is a detail in the USMC official history that tends not to appear in popular accounts of Peleliu, and it is worth pausing on. After Harris's 5th Marines had been fighting in the Umer Brogol for a week or so, his regimental mapping team went to work on the terrain inside the pocket. The official maps were useless. They showed a gently rounded ridge. What was actually inside the pocket was a maze that no existing map accurately represented sinkholes, not on any chart. Ridges running at angles that made no sense on the pre-invasion surveys, valleys that existed on the ground but didn't exist on paper. The 5th Marines produced their own map, a ground-level, accurate, detailed sketch of the Umer Brogol's interior, drawn from the experience of men who had been fighting inside it. This was not the map that anyone had used to plan the battle. This was the map that Harris's men drew because no other accurate map existed. During this mapping effort, the team encountered Lieutenant Colonel Lew Walt on a ridge that the sketch was being produced from. They named it after him Hill 100, or Walt's Ridge. It was on that hill that Captain Everett Pope earned his Medal of Honor during the battle. The hill was misnamed on subsequent official records because the mappers encountered Walt on it first. These things happen in battles. Maps are wrong. Names get attached to the wrong places. The ground is not what anyone said it was. The difference between Peleliu and many other battles is that in this case, one man saw the map was wrong before the worst of the killing happened, flew over the truth on September 19th, and was told, "We have our maps." The legacy question is harder than it sounds, because the lessons of Peleliu were not clearly transmitted to the next battle. The Japanese defensive doctrine that Nakagawa applied: the caves, the tunnels, the depth, the refusal to fight on the beach, was not a secret after Peleliu. The Marines had spent 73 days learning it in detail, paid for in roughly 10,000 casualties. The 81st Infantry Division had then spent the final weeks of the battle implementing the exact approach Harris had been urging since D+4. Everyone who survived Peleliu knew what tunneled cave defense cost and what the effective answer to it was. 3 months later, in February 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed on Iwo Jima. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who had been personally selected by the Japanese High Command to defend the island, had built 11 miles of completed tunnels with more than 1,500 underground rooms. The primary American intelligence estimate before the landing identified 39 defensive pillboxes on the island. The actual number was 332. The garrison was estimated at 12,000 men. The actual number was more than 21,000. The battle lasted 36 days. American casualties exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Harris's approach, siege tactics, combined arms, attack from a direction that uses the terrain's geometry against the defender, was eventually what reduced Iwo Jima to. But the lesson of how to read underground defenses from aerial photography, the lesson of what fukaku actually meant for assault planning, the lesson of what it cost when a division commander decided the high ground was gently rolling hills, because the pre-invasion photos showed jungle. Those lessons were not fully absorbed between Peleliu and Iwo Jima. The Marines who landed at Iwo Jima were some of the best prepared assault troops in the world. They had better weapons, better training, better equipment than almost any fighting force that had ever existed. And they still paid 7,000 dead for 11 miles of tunnels they didn't fully know were there. William Rupertus returned from Peleliu and died of a heart attack in March 1945. He had confided to a staff officer near the end of the fighting on the island, "This thing has just about got me beat." He was 54 years old and had spent 30 years in the Corps. He did not live to see the end of the war. Louis Chesty Puller survived and went on to become the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps, 5 Navy Crosses, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, combat service spanning 4 decades and 3 wars. His legacy at Peleliu has been debated for 80 years. His own assessment was the clearest he ever gave of any battle he fought. It was more or less of a massacre. Harold "Bucky" Harris remained in command of the 5th Marines through the battle and was later promoted. He did not become famous from Peleliu. He did not write a memoir that carried his name into popular memory the way Puller's biography did. The official USMC histories credit him clearly and consistently, but the official histories are not what most people read. Kunio Nakagawa's bones were found in 2003 by a group of veterans and historians who located his command post for the first time since the battle. An American veteran and a Japanese diplomat were there together when they found it. The cave was sealed, exactly as it had been when Nakagawa died. His effects were returned to Tokyo. The central fact of Peleliu is not the bravery of the men who fought there, which was extraordinary and beyond debate. It is not even the poor strategic judgment that sent them there in the first place. The central fact is simpler. A colonel flew over the truth on the 4th day of the battle, reported it accurately to men who had the authority to change the approach, and those men said no. That is a different kind of failure from the failures of intelligence that filled the Pacific War, different from the photographers at Pearl Harbor who missed the carriers, different from the analysts who miscounted Iwo Jima's pillboxes, different from the translators who couldn't keep up with captured Japanese tactical documents. Those were failures of information. Peleliu was a failure of a man choosing not to look when someone offered him the view. Harris's own reconnaissance was available to everyone with the rank to act on it. The OY-1 planes of VMO-3 were sitting on the Peleliu airstrip. Any officer who wanted to understand what the Umerbrogel actually was could have flown over it on September 19th, the same day Harris flew. Rupertus chose not to go. Puller chose not to go. They had their maps. The 1,749 men of the 1st Marines who became casualties in those 6 days of fighting were not killed by a failure of intelligence. They were killed by a failure of curiosity, the failure of 2 experienced, brave, proven combat officers to climb into a small observation plane and look at the ground their men were being asked to die on. Harris climbed in. He looked. He came back and said exactly what he saw. That is what soldiers are supposed to do, and the Marine Corps official record confirms that he did it. It is not a popular story because it does not have a clean ending. Harris wasn't vindicated by being proven right in some dramatic single moment. He was proven right by 6 days of casualties across the ridge from where his regiment was operating, and then proven right again when the siege tactics he'd been arguing for since September 19th finally became the standard approach, and the battle slowly, bloodily wound down. The 5th Marines sketch map of the Umerbrogel interior, the one that Harris's regiment drew because no accurate map existed, was the first honest document the 1st Marine Division had about the ground they were fighting on. It came about 3 weeks too late.